Welcome back, everyone, to episode number 9 of the speedrun. I'm currently rated 778, and as usual, I'm going to try and show no mercy and try and just provide a lot of lessons during the course of this episode. So let's hop into a 10-minute game, and I imagine I'll play a good number of games this episode, playing Parende, rated 825. And so far throughout this speed run, I've been sticking with the same opening repertoire, and my opponents are not failing to bring out their queen early. Usually, we don't see queen f3 on move 2. Usually we see either queen h5 going for the more traditional scholar's mate, or bishop c4 followed by queen h5 or queen f3. In this case, I don't mind just developing, and once the bishop comes to c4, I will not get checkmated. I'm obstructing the queen from attacking f7. But my opponent playing quickly maybe has played this position before. c3 is a very fine move because it does prevent me from playing knight d4. But I think the strategy here is just to castle kingside as quickly as possible. And I'll start with bishop c5, which not only prepares castling, but also discourages white from playing pawn d4. So white plays d3, and this does prepare bishop to g5. And I guess it's a question here, like, do I want to prevent bishop g5 with a move like h6? Because I could castle, could play d6. There are a few options. But I kind of like the idea of playing h6, even though sometimes this is not the best use of time in the opening. I do deprive white of the most active square for the bishop, and I'm just trying to be solid. Would like to castle, probably right now. And this way, my knight is no longer pinned to the f-pawn, because my rook is now helping defend as well. So white being very aggressive, we see pawn d4, which sometimes this move can be like an effective gambit of sorts. In this case, I have 3 attackers, and there's only one pawn defending d4, so I think I'm more than happy to take. And there's cases where sometimes white gambits to play e5, but I'm covering e5. I'm going to just take another pawn and accept my early holiday presents. No mercy, it's a free queen. So within just 9 moves, we see my opponent giving away a lot of pieces. My bishop is hanging. Now, yeah, I was going to say if white takes the bishop, I have the move queen e7. And really just showing no mercy. This is kind of downward spiraling for white. Now, it is a question, do I want to take the knight? I think a lot of players would just snatch the knight immediately. I do have the move here, rook e8, which I think I'm more inclined to play, because I'm leaving the knight attacked, but I'm more interested in just checkmating the king. And there's not too many moves here for white that prevent the checkmate. Castling is probably the best try, but then I'll have the option which knight to take. So life is very good here. Just made a cup of tea too. Yeah, let's take this knight. I have the battery on e-file. Maybe there's some cases where I can generate some back rank ideas against the king. Might be hard to do, especially with the bishop here preventing knight d2. We see bishop f4. And I think it's an important lesson, like when you're completely winning out of the opening, you just want to still be patient and focus on principles, not give away anything, really just try and clamp down on the opponent. And here I'm just attacking the knight. I was going to say that if white were to play either rook to e1, I'll be happy to take and then likely get a mate on the back rank. Here the pawn is attacked. Let's play d3. I could have traded, which would have been completely fine. but I like the prospect of pushing. Now I do have to see the knight is attacking the queen. Sometimes it's easy to miss these backward knight moves, but I don't mind taking another free thing. And yeah, multiple things hanging in white's position. Yeah, that game was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet. I really did not slow down. But as we see, sometimes this is just what it takes to win at this level. Just a matter of following opening principles, controlling the center, waiting for the opponent to, in this case, be generous. And yeah, starting with d4 and then basically everything that happened, it was just a one-sided game. So let's move on. I'll do another 10-minute game. Maybe one game away from getting to 800. I'll play e4, playing feather 15. And yeah, with the openings here, just trying to demonstrate like proper opening principles, not developing the queen early, and not even going for knight g5. At some point during the series, I'll probably play more attempted like fried liver attack, but I'm going to play the most solid move here, pawn d3. Completing this pawn chain, getting ready to activate this bishop. Now in this position, I'll start with knight to c3. And there is a plan here to play bishop g5 combined with knight d5. And actually, when I was about 8 years old, like around the age of this picture, this was one of the main openings I liked to play for white. And this is one of the earliest strategies I remember learning, is pinning the kingside knight and then bringing in this knight into the center to apply more pressure to this pinned knight on f6. And this is actually already pretty unpleasant for black to deal with, because the bishop can't really block, can't move backwards to e7 with the pawn committed to d6. And there's not a great way to add another defender to the knight. So we see black actually maybe trying to give me a taste of my own medicine, maybe preparing this move knight d4. But with especially being white and having the extra tempo, I have time to deal with this. And there's a few options here. Like I could start by taking, like take either way and force black to double the pawns on the king side. I'm a bit more inclined to just leave the pin, because this knight is not really going anywhere. And I like this move pawn to c3, which very simply prevents knight d4. And it's a very nice square for the pawn because it restricts both of these pieces. And here I'll take back with the queen. And I think bishop takes f3 was actually a pretty big mistake. Even though it was already difficult for black to play, now I have another attacker. There's now 3 attackers against the knight, which is still pinned to the queen. There's only 2 defenders. So it looks like next move I'll be guaranteed to win material. But not only that, I think it's very likely I'll have a mating attack within just a few moves. If we imagine I'm able to take, let's say with a knight, and then take, I'll already be threatening checkmates along the g file. So opponent plays kind of a random move. If I want to, I could play b4 and trap the bishop, but there's bigger fish to catch in this position. I'm going to go with the plan I was calculating just now, taking with the bishop. Yeah, I'm threatening checkmate in 1, and I'm threatening to take the queen. Black's best move is probably to take the bishop. Resigning is also perhaps a reasonable option there. And we see another like pretty one-sided game. I mean, this game was, I think, definitely higher quality than the first game, and just offers a very nice example of this middle game plan. Like when the opponent copies me from early on, I didn't really have to castle here. I was able to go for the immediate attack against the pinned knight. And it's a very common principle in chess. When you're pinning a piece, usually you don't want to immediately take the piece. You want to just apply pressure to the pinned piece. And yeah, opponent made life a bit easier with bishop takes f3. Now, before I move on to the next game, I should provide a lesson for my opponent. Like in this position, I think black had to be like very, very careful. And the best move was probably to move back. Even though it's passive, it diffuses a pin. So knight d5 is no longer as effective because black has the knight defended. Another alternative here for black is to wait before castling. Like the move I would have played here is pawn d6. And there's a nice little tip here I can give that, let's say you're playing black and your opponent plays bishop g5, preparing this. Because black's not castled, there's a nice approach to play h6. Let's say white maintains a pin with bishop h4. Then black can actually get away with playing g5. And because black has not committed the king, it's completely okay to expand on the king side. It's not good for white to take. Even though this kind of looks interesting, black will have enough ways to get initiative, also rook g6 coming to defend the knight. So very likely what would happen here is bishop g3, and then the plan for black would be to develop the queen side and then eventually castle on the queen side, and then try and attack later on the king side. So just a short opening lesson, but hopefully this provides some value, maybe to my opponent who could be watching this in the future, but really to anyone who plays a king's pawn opening as black and maybe doesn't know how to deal with this immediate strategy from white. It's good to sometimes delay castling to go for the early expansion. So with that, let's move on to the third game of this episode, playing Tomoin. And I have officially broken 800. So I think I'm due for a profile picture update for at least the next episode. And we'll repeat the same opening. It would be nice to get the same strategy a couple of games in a row. But here we see my opponent very quickly preventing bishop g5, preventing knight g5. So I'll have to use a different strategy here. And I'm going to start with knight c3 again. And perhaps we'll see just a different way of playing such a position. I'm expecting my opponent to play bishop c5. Should also note that I think this is the highest rated opponent I've played so far in the series. And as I progress, the games will definitely get just higher quality, and hopefully there will be just deeper lessons to learn from these games. My opponents won't be blundering so easily. So we see bishop b4, pinning the knight. Now this move isn't so annoying because I can now happily castle. And I really don't mind if black takes, because then I would strengthen the center and have the bishop pair. But we see d5. And with d5, I think my opponent maybe miscounted. There's 2 defenders and 3 attackers. Now it's a question what I want to take with. I think almost certainly I want to take with a knight, just to make sure that black can't throw in bishop takes knight. So yeah, let's snag a free pawn. It will be interesting though if we see my opponent maybe go for bishop g4 and then potentially knight d4, as we saw in the previous game. If my opponent were to play bishop g4, I would have happily played c3, kick the bishop and prevent knight d4. But now there's a big focal point on d5. Black has 3 attackers. I have only 2 defenders. So in a spot like this, I think it makes sense to trade. Like I won a pawn. I don't mind trading knights. This comes with check. Allows me to trade bishops next move. And here I'm really just going for the simple and solid approach. Like we clarify the position a little bit. I'll complete development. This is the most logical most central square for the bishop. And we'll just see how black chooses to progress. And we are approaching the middle game. And we see knight d4. I think this is another instance of my opponent just not realizing the number of attackers and defenders. I have 2 attackers. Black has 1 defender. It is a question, do I want to take with the knight or the bishop? Honestly, I think both moves are fine. It's probably not something to overthink. I'm going to take with the bishop just because after my opponent takes back, I take with knight, I hit the queen. So this gives me some nice initiative. I think very likely my knight will be coming to f5. Although if I play knight f5, black could attempt to capture on b2. I'm calculating. Queen takes b2, rook b1. Another option is to play c3, which defends and attacks. I like c3. Even though maybe I'm chasing the bishop to a more centralized square, it's a very solid setup for the pawns. I reinforce the knight. If bishop d6, black would be threatening mate, and then I would have either played knight f3 or f4. Here I definitely don't want to play f4 because that allows bishop takes d4, and black would then win back a pawn. So probably a question where to move the knight. Knight f5, knight f3. There's also queen a4 check to consider. I'll go for knight f3. It's a very stable move, hitting the queen. A nice thing about getting the knight away from d4 is I'm making way for the pawn. Ideally, I'd just like the 2 pawns in the center. Yeah, I'll continue here with pawn d4. I was going to say that there's cases where if I allow queen takes e4, then rook e1 would be a pin along the e-file. Now bishop d6 is not threatening mates because my knight defends. So I'm debating here, like e5 is actually a really nice looking move. I could also play queen d2 and just try and head towards an endgame. Probably not a moment I want to spend too long on. So I think queen d2 makes sense. This does set up the trap, queen e4, rook e1. Oh no, my pawn. Yeah, the knight is very important, defending the queen and the mate threat. And queen f6 now allows e5 to come with a fork. Let's take with pawn, keeping the initiative, hitting the queen. So I've gone up a bit of material, up a knight and a pawn. And from this position, I would really like to prevent black from castling. Might be hard to do, though. There's a move here that I don't think too many beginners would play. I think a lot of people would play either rook a d1, maybe rook f e1, get the rooks involved. But I really like the idea of playing pawn e6, just being immediately confrontational. And the point is not only I'm trying to open the e-file, like if queen takes e6, I'll have rook e1. But another point is if the pawn takes back, then I have knight e5, attacking the queen and preparing queen to d7. And this is what we call a clearance idea. Maybe not necessarily a clearance tactic, but I'm simply clearing the square for the knight, also trying to clear the file to exploit the king. And the nice thing about playing knight e5 is I attack the queen, I threaten queen d7, but I'm also taking away f7 from the black queen. So yeah, not easy for black to defend against everything there. And now this is forced checkmate, queen f7 coming next. No mercy. And another win. I think that was a nice instructive game. Saw some nice ideas there towards the end, of course, with giving away the e-pawn. And my opponent made definitely a handful of like very clear mistakes. First of all, playing d5, just giving free material, and they were very similar types of mistakes. Later playing knight d4, just not realizing that the square was better controlled by white than by black. So sometimes this is a very common pitfall for players, especially at the sub 1000 elo, is just giving away from free material when it's not necessary. And one of the simple secrets to passing 1000 is simply by minimizing cases like this. Even when you give away free pawns, they can definitely add up over the course of a game. So yeah, instead of playing a move like d5 here, if my opponent played d6, it would have been probably a much harder battle. And yeah, I was going to say that if we saw a d6, then like maybe I would play h3. Maybe I would play something like knight d5 to pressure the bishop and prepare c3. There are definitely some possibilities for white to continue developing. So let's do at least one more. Just checking my recording here. Looks like everything is smooth. Yeah, let's go again. Playing Osgurs 66. My opponent is on the cusp of breaking 900. I'll try and ruin their dreams in this game. I do want to note that with every opponent I play, their ratings will be refunded. This is an authorized speedrun account on chess.com. Now we see the Philidor Defense, which is pawn d6. And it's a slightly more passive approach because black is locking in their own bishop. We see bishop g4. I'm actually trying to remember some like vague memory of some nifty traps here. Whenever the bishop comes to g4, you do want to consider ideas of bishop takes f7 or knight takes e5. Neither move really works here. Bishop takes f7, king takes knight g5. Almost looks good, but allows queen takes g5. So I think I'm better off just developing, seeing what black is up to. Okay, we see the trade. I'll take with queen, threatening mate. This is one case where I was provoked to bring out my queen early, but it's a perfectly fine square, especially given that black is underdeveloped. Now my opponent is defending against the threat. The first move that comes to mind here is knight d5, which I don't know if knight d5 is actually so effective because it does allow black to play queen d7. And I'm dreaming of ideas of like bishop b5 and queen takes b5 and knight takes e7. But the problem with that variation, if we imagine the bishop comes to b5, black would have c6. And I don't want to fall into like just playing hope chess and hoping my opponent blunders, where I'm just playing like suboptimal moves. Now it's very possible knight d5 is still good and it centralizes a knight and keeps initiative. But I'm not really seeing the follow-up after the queen d7 and then preparing pawn c6. So I think I would rather just keep it simple, like focus on the development of my final minor piece. And we see c6 anyway. So let's just focus on developing. No need to go too crazy too soon. Knight f6. And the nice thing about this position for me is I'm like nearly fully developed. Black is a bit slow because the queen is blocking the bishop, which blocks a king. So there's a few options here. One obvious option is to move the bishop to pin the knight. But I'm not sure how effective that is because like if bishop here and black plays h6, I'm not so inclined to take and just trade. I think that would make life easier for black. And if I move back, then maybe black expands with g5. So I think I'm much happier just playing bishop e3. And the strategy behind this move is to focus in the center and ideally get in the move pawn d4. And the common principle is when the opponent is very slow to develop and slow to castle, usually you want to look for pawn breaks in the center that will open up the position, like mainly open the files or just open lines for the minor pieces. And here we see the bishop's already coming to life. Black plays c5, which hits the bishop on d4. But the drawback of this move is the pawn can't move backwards, and these squares are now available for my knight or potentially bishop. So a move like knight d5 is already a possible consideration. I mean, bishop takes f6 followed by knight d5 also looks very attractive. I'm taking time here to consider the options. I think there's a lot of good options here, like taking or bishop e3 are probably the two most normal moves. I'm going to play a move here which is based on basically a 3-move calculation and starting with knight d5. The idea is I'm attacking the queen, and I'm trying to provoke black to take so I can open the e-file. And if I can get this pawn off the e-file, then there's going to be potential to win the queen. Speaking of winning the queen, I can win it right away. Not sure if my opponent just overlooked that or maybe figured they're getting some material. Now it's a queen for 2 knights. So very good trade for white. And I definitely want to try and keep my foot on the gas here. I mean, a move like rook d1 is very natural. But I see that the b7 pawn is undefended. So the move that comes to mind is e5. And if black takes, then I can take the pawn and trap the rook. So that looks really, really nice. Not to mention the knight is pinned to the f-pawn. So yeah, sometimes like after the first mistake, it can very easily kind of snowball into just even worse position for black. I'm going to keep snagging free pawns. Just want to make sure I don't mouse slip or blunder the queen. But this is a very difficult position to come back from for black. Rook does attack the bishop. The simple move here would be bishop to b3. But the more energetic move would be, I like this move bishop to b5. Because I leave the pawn attacked, but I'm threatening something a bit more valuable. And the knight is essentially pinned to the bishop. And now the rook is tied down to defending the knight. So yeah, rook d8 was probably the best move there. But now, what to do? So I'm up material. I could trade if I want, but I don't think there's any reason to trade right away. I think the simplest strategy in this position is to realize I have a couple passed pawns on the queen side, and I might as well push them, especially this a pawn. It's supported by the rook. And once my queen gets out of the way, let's say queen c7 or queen b7. Couple options here. I think both moves are perfectly fine. I'll play queen c7, attacking the rook. Now this frees a way for the pawn, so I'm 4 pawn moves away from making another queen. I think black's best try here would be bishop b6 to attack the queen and defend the rook through X-ray vision. With bishop e7, I'm happy to keep pushing. I have noticed this a lot in like lower level games of players sometimes struggling to convert the material advantage. And like sometimes the simplest thing is just to look for your passed pawns and push them, and it can very, very often end the game much more quickly. So here I want to, of course, make sure that I'm not hanging my queen. Also, I have to watch out for my time too. I've spent a lot of time trying to explain things in depth Um, yeah, I'm going to play a move here which just simplifies. I think it's completely fine giving the queen to get a knight and rook off the board, even though that's technically a more favorable trade for black. It just simplifies the position a lot, and now this should be an easier approach. Although black is going to resist, maybe. Let's keep pushing. Yeah, I'm not making another queen right away, and I am possibly losing this pawn. Now, it turns out that this pawn was actually a bit poisonous, because I have this move bishop to f5. It's not that black had too many other like great-looking options, but now I'm not only hitting the knight, but I'm taking away the square from the king, so I'm setting up a back rank checkmate. Opponent does defend against a mate, but now I'm up a couple of rooks and a bishop, and these pawns are not going to be enough. So we'll see if my opponent chooses to fight here. Oh, game abandoned. Okay. So again, my opponent will be refunded their rating points. Hopefully they can break 900 at some point soon. But anyway, I think that was a pretty smooth game. It stemmed from a somewhat passive opening from black. Usually it's not a great idea to trade off the bishop so early because it really just helped me activate. And yeah, there's cases where you should be happy just getting your queen out and have it apply pressure to the opponent's position. I think one of the main takeaways going into the middle game here was just to look for the way to open the center, and this allowed me to get a pretty big advantage from early on, especially when my opponent plundered the queen. The one thing I want to show was if my opponent were to take, at first it looks like I'm losing material, but the whole idea was to win the queen on the e-file. This would be a really nice pin. So if we entered this position, then yeah, black is under major pressure because rook e1 is very hard to deal with. Probably the queen would have to move, but I still play rook e1, and yeah, bishop e7 would allow bishop takes g7. So yeah, pretty difficult position for black to play. But anyway, I think there were a lot of nice instructive games from this episode. Hope you learned a thing or two. Do stay tuned for more. If you have questions or comments, as usual, leave them below. I look forward to reading them, and stay tuned for another episode. See you guys soon.